Although today an integral part of Australian culture, Indigenous communities have at times been shunned. However, the government has recognised the need for Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities to exist cooperatively and in relation to each other. Many other areas of society have also recognised this. This video will explore this relationship. Once it is accepted that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are both an integral part of today's Australian society, the need for good relationships becomes clear. However, this is not easy to do. There is a history of conflict between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and there often remains a firm line of separation. Lynn Davis, Professor of Indigenous Studies in Canada, has noted the difficulties of building these relationships. Even when people have the best of intentions, it remains possible to harm relationships through misunderstandings or making assumptions. A proper place for honest dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous is necessary. This has undoubtedly influenced the number of Indigenous liaison officer jobs available in all sorts of different establishments, from schools to the police, healthcare to businesses. The aim of many of these positions is to help Indigenous communities close the gap which puts them at a disadvantage to non-Indigenous parts of society. The organisation Indigenous Community Links is an organisation which supports Indigenous communities in accessing mainstream services available to all Australians, such as housing, healthcare and welfare. This is important as many Indigenous communities have existed independently of these services for so long and have little knowledge of how to access them. Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations have lived side by side for generations, but not with equality. One barrier to good relations between the two groups is the history of hardship and hurt to the Indigenous communities. With the aim of fostering good relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd formally apologised to members of the Stolen Generation in 2008. This significant political movement was under intense media scrutiny, showing the importance of this relationship in today's society. Yet the relationship remains fraught and littered with disagreement, despite advances like these. Maggie Walter, researcher in social sciences quoted on your screen, believes there are two competing perspectives in this relationship. One of these strongly promotes reconciliation through acknowledging the causes of hurt to Indigenous communities. The other side, however, is wary of formal recognition of wrong and takes a negative attitude to Indigenous culture. She notes that the often confused and conflicting direction of public attitudes towards Indigenous people, Indigenous culture issues, and Indigenous political topics. The Australian society seems to be conflicted over the idea of reconciliation. However, organisations like Reconciliation Australia work towards building relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people for the benefit of all. More than a quarter of the Indigenous Australian population lives in Queensland. According to the 2011 census, 41.5% of Queensland's Indigenous population live in and around Cairns. Since 2011, Cairns Regional Council has had a Reconciliation Action Plan, following the programme launched by Reconciliation Australia in 2006. The council website states, quote, "The RAP programme turns good intentions into action by encouraging and supporting organisations, large and small, to engage within their sphere of influence in the national effort to close the 17-year gap in life expectancy between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their fellow Australians." In 2008, the United Nations encouraged good relationships and recognition of Indigenous people in the publication United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This declaration not only states the rights of Indigenous people as human beings and therefore entitled to the same rights as any human being, but reinforces the notion that Indigenous people have a right to play a full and active role in society, and determine their own lives and future, and to actively participate in guiding the future of the country in which they live. The Australian government supported the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and on its website recognises that business as usual is no longer a viable policy response for government. In response to this, the government set aside $10 million in 2010 to support Reconciliation Australia. The process of healing the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous parts of society must therefore be based on deep listening and respect. There must be a culture of respectful but honest discussion in order for progress to be made, and to avoid the issues highlighted by Lynn Davis, such as making assumptions or following stereotypes. It is only by listening to what each community has to say for themselves that we can learn about each other's cultures and ideas, and deep listening only happens when there is a strong sense of respect for the other as a fellow Australian, but also as a fellow human being. Respect and understanding go hand in hand. Today's communities are not in a position to change the past, but they are in a position to affect future relationships.